Sometimes the most dangerous predators hide in plain sight, wearing the perfect mask of normalcy. In my case, Evil lived right next door, mowing his lawn every Saturday morning and waving cheerfully over the fence. But masks have a way of slipping when you're not supposed to be watching. I'm Jessica Martinez, 42 years old, and this is the story of how my perfect neighbor turned my peaceful life upside down, and how one sleepless night revealed a truth that nearly cost me everything. 3 years ago, I moved to Maple Ridge Drive after my divorce. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a quiet cul-de-sac where I could rebuild my life and give my teenage daughter, Emma, a stable home. The house was perfect: white picket fence, mature oak trees, and neighbors who actually knew each other's names. My next-door neighbor, David Chen, seemed like the ideal neighbor from day one. He was in his mid-40s, married to a lovely woman named Linda, with 2 young children who played quietly in their immaculate backyard. David worked in IT for a major corporation, left for work at exactly 7:30 a.m. every morning, and returned home by 6 p.m. sharp. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask," he'd said with a warm smile when I first moved in. "We neighbors need to look out for each other." He was the kind of neighbor everyone wanted. When my car wouldn't start last winter, David was outside with jumper cables before I'd even finished calling for help. When Emma got sick with the flu, Linda brought over homemade soup. During the neighborhood barbecues, David was always the first to volunteer for setup and cleanup. The kids on the street adored him. He'd set up a basketball hoop in his driveway and let all the local children play. He organized the annual block party, complete with a bounce house and face painting. Parents trusted him implicitly. He was the go-to babysitter when couples needed a date night. "David's amazing with kids," my neighbor Sarah would say. "He's like the dad everyone wishes they had." But looking back now, I realized there were signs, small things that seemed innocent at the time, but took on a sinister meaning once I learned the truth. Like how he always volunteered to coach the neighborhood kids' sports teams, insisting on private training sessions, or how he'd find excuses to be outside whenever the school bus dropped off children. The way he'd remember every child's birthday and show up with elaborate gifts that seemed too expensive for a casual neighbor. I dismissed my occasional unease as post-divorce paranoia. My therapist had warned me that I might be overly suspicious of men after what my ex-husband had put me through. David seemed so normal, so helpful, so trustworthy. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in October, around 2 a.m. I'd been battling insomnia since the divorce, and I was in my kitchen making chamomile tea when I heard a sound of a shovel hitting dirt. I looked out my window and saw David in his backyard, digging a hole near his garden shed. At first, I thought maybe he was doing some late-night gardening project, but something about his body language seemed off. He kept looking around nervously, and he was digging with the intensity of someone trying to finish a task quickly. I watched for about 20 minutes as he buried a large duffel bag, then carefully covered the hole and spread mulch over it. When he was done, he stood there for a moment, looking satisfied, then went back inside. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. There was something deeply unsettling about what I'd witnessed. Who buries a duffel bag in their backyard at 2 a.m.? My imagination ran wild with possibilities, none of them good. The next morning, David was his usual cheerful self, waving as he left for work. But I noticed his hands had small cuts and dirt under his nails, evidence of his midnight digging session. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was just old family documents, or something valuable he wanted to keep safe. But the more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. That weekend, David and Linda took their kids to visit Linda's parents. I saw them packing the car and heard David tell our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, that they'd be gone until Sunday evening. Saturday night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to see what was in that duffel bag. I waited until after midnight, then snuck into David's backyard with a small shovel from my garden shed. The ground was still soft from his digging, and it didn't take long to uncover the bag. My hands shook as I unzipped it. Inside was a collection of items that made my blood run cold: children's clothing, small toys, dozens of photographs, and electronic devices. But it was the photographs that made me realize the true horror of what I discovered. They were pictures of children from our neighborhood. Not innocent photos, but surveillance images taken from a distance. Kids walking home from school, playing in their yards, getting off the bus. Some photos were taken through windows, showing children in their bedrooms. At the bottom of the bag was a laptop and several external hard drives. I didn't have the courage to look at what was on them, but I had a terrible feeling I knew. I carefully reburied the bag, my mind racing. David Chen, the perfect neighbor, the man everyone trusted with their children, was a predator, and I was the only one who knew. The next morning, I called the police. Detective Sarah Rodriguez arrived within an hour, and I told her everything I'd seen. She listened carefully, taking notes, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. "Mrs. Martinez," she said gently, "these are very serious accusations. We'll need more than just your word about a buried bag to get a search warrant. Do you have any photos or other evidence?" I realized I should have taken pictures, but I'd been too shocked to think clearly. "I know how it sounds," I said, "but you don't know what I saw." Those children's photos, there were dozens of them. Detective Rodriguez promised to look into it, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. David had no criminal record, no complaints against him, and was respected in the community. I was a divorced woman with a history of anxiety who'd been through a bitter custody battle. When David returned from his trip that Sunday, he was his usual friendly self, but I noticed he seemed to be watching me more carefully. Had he somehow noticed the disturbed ground? Could he tell someone had been in his yard? Over the next few days, I began to notice changes. David would appear in his yard whenever Emma came home from school. He'd find excuses to strike up conversations with me, asking about my work schedule, my evening plans, whether I'd been sleeping well. "You look tired, Jessica," he'd say with apparent concern. "Are you having trouble sleeping again?" The fact that he knew about my insomnia was disturbing. I'd never mentioned it to him directly. Then a strange incident started. My garbage cans would be tipped over, the contents scattered across my driveway. My car tires would be flat in the morning, with no obvious cause. I'd find footprints in my garden, too large to be Emma's. When I called Detective Rodriguez about these incidents, she suggested I might be dealing with local teenagers playing pranks. But I knew better. David was sending me a message. He knew I was watching him, and he was watching me back. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Emma was at her father's house for the week, and I was alone. I was in my living room watching TV when I heard my back door open. I froze. I always locked that door. Footsteps moved through my kitchen, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the stairs, planning to barricade myself in my bedroom and call 911. "Jessica?" David's voice called out softly. "Are you home? I saw your lights on and wanted to check on you." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I stayed silent, hoping he'd think I wasn't home and leave. "I know you're here," he continued, his voice taking on a different tone. "We need to talk." I made it to my bedroom and locked the door, then called 911. The dispatcher told me officers were on their way, but I could hear David moving around downstairs. "Jessica," he called up the stairs. "I know you've been in my yard. I know you've seen things that confused you, but you don't understand the situation. Let me explain." The police arrived within minutes, but by then, David was gone. The back door was standing open, and there was no sign of forced entry. The responding officers took a report, but without evidence of breaking and entering, there wasn't much they could do. "Maybe your neighbor has a key," Officer Martinez suggested. "Did you ever give him one for emergencies?" I realized with horror that I had. When I'd first moved in, we'd exchanged spare keys just in case. I'd completely forgotten about it. The next morning, I changed all my locks, but the damage was done. David knew I was onto him, and he was escalating his intimidation tactics. That afternoon, I received a call from Emma's school. She hadn't shown up for her after-school program, and they wanted to know if I'd picked her up early. My blood turned to ice. Emma was supposed to be at her father's house, but what if she'd come home early? What if David had? I called my ex-husband frantically. Emma was safe with him, had been there all day, but the call from the school was a clear message. David knew about Emma, knew her schedule, knew how to get to me through her. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't wait for the police to take me seriously. I had to get evidence myself. I set up a hidden camera in my bedroom window, positioned to record David's backyard. If he was going to dig up that bag and move it, I was going to catch him in the act. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. David maintained his normal routine, but I noticed he was spending more time in his backyard. sometimes just standing near the spot where the bag was buried. Then, on a Sunday night, the camera captured something that made my blood run cold. David was in his backyard again, but this time he wasn't alone. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, was with him. I recognized him as Tommy Fletcher, who lived 3 houses down. The boy looked confused, scared. I watched in horror as David led Tommy toward the garden shed. My hands shook as I called 911, but even as I spoke to the dispatcher, I knew it might be too late. "There's a child in danger," I told the operator. "My neighbor has taken a little boy into his shed. You need to send officers immediately." This time, the police responded with urgency. 3 patrol cars arrived within minutes, and I met them in the street, pointing toward David's backyard. "The shed," I said. He took the boy into the shed. The officers surrounded the property while Detective Rodriguez knocked on the front door. David answered, acting confused and concerned about the police presence. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked innocently. "We received a report about a child on your property," Detective Rodriguez said. "Do you have a boy named Tommy Fletcher with you?" David's face remained calm, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. "Tommy? No, I haven't seen him. Is he missing?" That's when we heard it, a muffled cry coming from the direction of the shed. The officers moved quickly, forcing open the shed door. Inside, they found Tommy, tied up and terrified, along with evidence that made even the seasoned detectives sick to their stomachs. The shed was set up like a photography studio, with professional lighting and multiple cameras. The walls were covered with photos of local children, some taken from a distance, others clearly taken in this very shed. But the most damning evidence was the laptop David had apparently been using to document his crimes. The hard drives I'd seen buried in the yard contained years of evidence, photos, videos, and detailed records of his activities. David was arrested on the spot, charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and possession of child pornography. As they led him away in handcuffs, he looked directly at me. "You don't know what you've done," he said quietly. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." The investigation revealed the full scope of David's crimes. He'd been operating for over a decade, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood, always presenting himself as the perfect family man. Linda, his wife, had no idea about his double life. The children I'd seen playing in his yard were actually his victims, kept compliant through manipulation and fear. The FBI found evidence linking David to missing children cases across 3 states. He'd been using his IT skills to run an underground network, trading images and information with other predators across the country. Tommy Fletcher was rescued, physically unharmed, but the psychological trauma would take years to heal. His parents thanked me through tears, saying I'd saved their son's life. "If you hadn't been watching," his mother said, "if you hadn't called when you did." The trial was a media circus. David's defense team tried to paint me as an unstable, divorced woman with a vendetta against her neighbor. They claimed I'd planted evidence, that I was seeking attention and revenge, but the physical evidence was overwhelming. The buried duffel bag, the shed setup, the digital files, everything corroborated my story. David was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Linda divorced him immediately and moved away with their children, who thankfully had been protected from their father's true nature. The house next door sat empty for months before being sold to a young couple with no children. The neighborhood changed after David's arrest. Parents became more cautious, more watchful. The annual block party was canceled. Children were no longer allowed to play unsupervised in the street. Some neighbors blamed me for destroying their sense of security. "We never had problems before you moved in," Mrs. Patterson said coldly. "Maybe you should have minded your own business." But most people understood that I'd done what needed to be done. The parents of the children in David's photographs thanked me personally. The FBI agent in charge of the case told me that my actions had prevented countless future victims. "Predators like David count on people not wanting to get involved," Agent Wilson explained. "They rely on the fact that neighbors don't want to believe the worst about someone they trust. Your willingness to act on your suspicions saved lives." 6 months after David's conviction, I received a letter from Tommy Fletcher. In his 8-year-old handwriting, he'd written, "Thank you for saving me. I'm not scared anymore because I know there are people like you who watch out for kids." That letter sits framed on my desk. A reminder that sometimes the most difficult decisions are the most important ones. Emma and I still live on Maple Ridge Drive. She's in high school now, more aware of the dangers in the world, but also more confident in her ability to recognize them. The experience taught both of us that trust must be earned, not freely given. The new neighbors, the Johnsons, are a lovely retired couple who garden together and wave politely over the fence. But I watch them too, as I watch everyone now, not with paranoia, but with the healthy caution of someone who's learned that evil often wears a friendly face. David writes to me from prison sometimes, letters that go straight to the FBI. He still maintains his innocence, still claims I ruined his life. But I know the truth. I didn't ruin his life. I ended his ability to ruin the lives of innocent children. The house where his shed stood has been torn down and replaced with a playground. The new owners didn't know the history when they bought it, but when they learned what had happened, they decided to turn the space into something positive. Sometimes I sit on my porch and watch children playing on the swings and slide that now occupy the spot where David once carried out his crimes. Their laughter fills the air where once there was only darkness and fear. That's the thing about evil. It's often defeated not by grand gestures or heroic actions, but by ordinary people who refuse to look away when something doesn't feel right. By neighbors who care enough to pay attention, even when it's uncomfortable. My therapist says I saved those children not just through my actions, but through my willingness to trust my instincts despite social pressure to ignore them. In a world where people often choose convenience over conscience, I chose to act. The perfect neighbor turned out to be perfectly evil, but sometimes the most imperfect decision, the one that makes you unpopular, that disrupts the peace, that forces people to confront uncomfortable truths, is the one that saves lives. David Chen is where he belongs now, and the children of Maple Ridge Drive are safer because one sleepless night, I chose to look out my window and pay attention to what I saw. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who seem the most trustworthy, but they're also the most vulnerable when their masks slip, even for just a moment. I'm still the neighbor who watches, and I always will be.